Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time again. Let's talk metal. Except tonight we're not talking exactly metal. We're going to be talking Deathrock. I'm doing a book review video here. Haven't done one in a while because I haven't come across a ton of books related to, heavy music that I read and thought I wanted to review. But late in 2024, I did stumble into one. I was watching a video on a goth channel, and I unfortunately do not remember the name of the channel. It was somebody who had put up videos but kind of spaced out over time. They were decent kind of encapsulations of like different bands and stuff like that. And in one of the videos, he made sort of a passing reference to a book called Phantoms that sort of documented the Deathrock scene. And it kind of caught my attention because I had never heard of this book, and I've never seen a lot printed about the Deathrock scene. So I like stopped the video, backed it up, got the full titles. Like, okay, let's look that up. As is typical when looking for a book, you type the name into Amazon and see what you can find. And in this case, you don't find anything because the book's not available through Amazon. So you had to dig a little deeper. But yeah, at the end of the day, found the book. It had been printed and distributed through Lulu.com, which I was unfamiliar with, but is apparently a print to demand company. So you order a book, they print a brand new copy of it for you and send it to you. It's a little different, and it takes slightly longer because they don't have copies in stock. They have to print the copy for you. But it means they don't have to print a ton of copies up front. The author isn't stuck sitting on boxes of unsold copies for years or anything like that. So it saves you a ton of storage space and pouring a ton of resources into printing copies all at once, which may take you months or years to sell. So interesting business model. I guess they've been around for a while. Again, this was my first time dealing with them, but I ordered the book from Lulu.com, and here it is. It's called Phantoms, The Rise of Deathrock from the LA Punk Scene. The picture on the front cover is a famous one from the back of the Hell Comes to Your House compilation album and features a lot of members from sort of, the key Deathrock scene. Mary Sims from 45 Grave there in the center of the picture. All right. Couple of things to note. Again, if you decide you want to copy this, I would recommend just ordering it from Lulu.com. It didn't take very long to arrive at all. I think from the day I ordered it to the day it arrived, it was 10 days or less. So even though they had to print the book, it's not like it took a very long time. I have seen some copies for sale on sites like eBay, but they actually sell for more than the copies just buying it directly from Lulu. I see no copies of it really listed on Amazon. Maybe there's a used copy here or there. eBay has a few, but they tend to be around 55 bucks a piece, whereas you can just buy it from Lulu for like $40. So, and it's new, it's not a used copy. So yeah, there's really not a reason to buy one of the second copies that people are asking more for than what you could buy a brand new copy for. Anyway, getting back to the book itself, subtitled An Oral History by Mikey Bean. I don't know a lot about Mikey. It seems like, he's just, a big fan of the music and the scene, not somebody who was necessarily there on the scene at the time it was developing. He kind of got into this later. And reading just a couple of interviews with him, one of the big points was that he wanted a book about this scene, and there didn't seem to be one. And in talking to people about it, nobody else was interested in writing it. Some people suggested that he do it, and, well, so he did. One of the books that inspired him was this one. We've got The Neutron Bomb, which is a history of the LA punk scene. So it's like, yeah, this was a good book, liked it, was into a lot of this stuff. He's like, but then it kind of, ends at, a certain point, and he wanted the story told of what came next, after like, Darby Crash died and the LA punk scene was, kind of taken over by hardcore and bands drifted in different directions, some of which were into what became known as death rock. So he started interviewing everybody he could track down and ended up putting out this massive book. And this thing, again, for scale, these are like, full 8.5 by 11 pages. So big print book, not just your typical smaller, easy to hold paperback book here. Um, and it's like 600 pages or so long. This thing is a brute of a book. But as such, it's also extremely thorough, which is going to appeal to a lot of folks who want to dig into the mechanics of this. It's laid out kind of similarly to We Got the Neutron Bomb or the Please Kill Me punk history, where it's meant to be an oral history, mostly being told from the point of view through interviews with people who were on the scene. Yeah, Mikey has very short editorial notes spliced in here and there, but he's basically done, just an insane amount of interviews and spliced those together to tell the story of this particular scene. Now, as is pretty common for this kind of book, there's a cast of characters list in the front. So if there are names that pop up that you're not familiar with, you can always flip back to the front and it will tell you kind of quick like who that person was, what the key bands they were in, or what, if they were a producer, a zine writer, or whatever. It's kind of an essential feature for a book like this because, yeah, if you already know every single person involved, you may not even need to read the book for a whole lot. But for those who don't know it in detail, yeah, being able to quickly look up who's who helps a ton. There's tons of pictures throughout the book. Tons of flyers are featured. Sorry, I gotta tilt this a little lower. But yeah, there's tons of old gig flyers. So it discusses the bands, but it also there's a lot of discussion throughout the book about the specific clubs that were central to the scene. Places like, the Mask, the Brave Dog, etc., etc. And so yeah, you get to see a lot of. Well, we're not showing that flyer because that's a little risque, as some of these are, of course. But yeah, there's, tons of images spliced in along the way as well. Um, with Deathrock, of course, two big names pop to mind for most folks, 45 Grave and Christian Death. Both of them get a ton of attention in the book. I it definitely feels like, 45 Grave is kind of central to the book, the way it's laid out. 45 Graves, the band covered in the very first chapter. Mary Sims and several of the other members, their interview clips are worked into lots of other chapters on lots of the other bands and locations, labels, and events as well. So you definitely get the sense that, yeah, 45 Grave was meant to be, kind of the centerpiece, which is fair. They were one of the biggest bands on the scene. 45 Grave, I don't know if they're incredibly well known outside of the scene. And they kind of discussed that a little bit in here, that the band feels like, their peak period, they didn't record very much. And that by the time their debut album, Sleep in Safety, came out, they kind of felt like it was very late in their run. They're like, yeah, we really should have got some stuff out sooner, but we didn't. So they felt like they kind of missed the boat a little bit. The second big staple band is, of course, Christian Death. And they get a ton of coverage in the book. There's two extremely long chapters dedicated to Christian death. I think each chapter is like 75 pages or so. So Christian death, you get a good chunk of the book for sure. And spends, a ton of time on the early phase with Roz Williams, all of the Only Theater of Pain lineup and lineup shifts. But it also does a lot of justice to the later era. The second chapter is essentially focusing a lot more on what happened after that original lineup split. And Roz, teamed up with Valor for a period of time, coming out of Pompeii 99. And then Valor, of course, kind of taking the Christian Death name and running with it. And you ending up with multiple versions of Christian Death or over time. And I feel like both versions were treated very fairly. There are a lot of Christian Death fans who only like one version of the band or the other. And there's been a tremendous amount of shit talking back and forth, over the years. There's Roz fans, not always big fans of Valor, and vice versa. There's a lot of folks, who are big on the Valor material, who don't care for all the stuff Roz did over the years. But yeah, I think Mikey does a very good and very fair job covering both halves of the Christian Death family tree. And there's actually a lot of interview stuff with Valor, and the other members of that branch, Gitane, Demon, and such, which is kind of cool to see. It's not an era I've ever seen much in print about. And I've heard people say that even now, their Valor has like a very limited online footprint, that there's never been a lot of information about the guy out there. So the fact that, he was willing to do an obviously pretty long sit down interview with Mikey uh, for the book, I think that speaks really well to the book. You can draw your own conclusions about things he says versus what the people in the other camp say in the book. I think there's definitely points where they're each kind of, framing things to suit their own version of history, however you want to say it. But yeah, very interesting to get a really long, in-depth breakdown of Christian Death's history. But yeah, again, that only covers less than maybe the 45 Grave and Christian Death stuff together might cover 200 pages. There's still 400 pages to fill up. So there's tons of information on lots of other bands as well. Some people will know this stuff well. Most of it's brand new to me. It's never a scene I've known in depth. But yes, you get a lot of detailed breakdowns on everything from, nervous gender, superheroines, aphotic culture. The list goes on and on and on. And I get the sense that, yeah, a lot of these bands didn't have much of a recording output. There were some compilation appearances here and there, a single here and there. Some of the bands were able to make an album, some weren't. Some recorded some demo stuff, but it didn't get released until much later on, perhaps. So yeah, it's a scene that doesn't seem like it's particularly well represented with recordings. That a lot of it was done on the live scene with bands playing live a lot, mixing and matching members, kind of incestuous lineup changes like you'd expect in a scene similar to this. But that it just doesn't have the recorded, you know, documentation of some other scenes, like maybe the punk scene or the hardcore scene, or in metal terms, the new wave of British heavy metal, where there's, bands did a lot of recording, lots of singles and stuff poured out of the woodwork. Doesn't really seem to be the case with the LA death rock scene, which of course is kind of a shame. There's opportunities to hear some of these bands on YouTube through old live footage that people have managed to upload. But yeah, in other cases, seems like a lot of these bands kind of came and went, and there's not a whole lot left to document, which I think is part of the reason that, Mikey wanted to have a book like this, because yeah, how else is information about these bands going to survive? So lots of cool stuff in the book. Some things that, are, I wouldn't even necessarily say complaints, but things to be aware of about the book. It is an extremely slow read. Not just because it's, huge pages that are chock full of, words. It's, normal font size. It's not like it's 4-point font or something, but it takes a long time to read through, four huge columns just to get through one page to the next. When you're reading it too, another thing that slows you down is that Mikey has really cut and pasted these interview clips into very short segments in a lot of cases. Let's see if I can kind of zoom in a little bit on this patch, and you can kind of see how often the name of who is speaking is in bold, and you can see how often, just in this one column, he kind of keeps switching from person to person to person. I'm not perfectly clear whether he did a lot of these like in big group interviews and maybe had like four people talking at him at the same time, and how many of them were maybe shorter interviews, and he's again kind of cut and pasted the comments together. Regardless, I do wish the clips weren't so incredibly short a lot of the time. In a lot of cases, you're getting like half a sentence, here's the next topic is, castration squad. And they'll be like, the next 7 lines will be one line apiece from 7 different people. kind of giving you like, their first impression, like, oh, Castration Squad, I remember that band. Person number two, that was a cool band. Person number three, wasn't so and so in that band? Person number four, I think that band was out of this particular suburb of LA. And it can be a bit confusing keeping up with who is saying what, especially when you probably don't know who most of the people talking are. So, like line number one, you're like, okay, line number one's by this person. Who was that again? Flip back to the front, go back, read the line. Okay, next line. This is said by somebody else. Who's this person? Go back to the front of the book, go read the line. So it can make it a really, really slow book to progress through. After a while, of course, you start to get used to the names. You can make the connections faster. Something else I realized for segments of the book is that it's not always necessary to denote who is saying each line, especially when you get to a section like the one I just described, where it's like, okay, now we're going to talk about this band. And the next 10 lines are just different people saying, yeah, I like that band. Hey, that band was cool. I didn't like that band very much. Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of them in years. It doesn't really matter who's saying those things. So you can just kind of read through those comments, not necessarily needing to stop and check the name every single time. It allows you to move at a little better pace through the book. One last thing I'd point out about the pacing. The chapters are long. Now there are, subdivisions in the chapter. There's always these kind of little symbols that'll break it up into pieces. I do feel like those pieces are sometimes put in odd places. That he might be talking about a certain band. There'll be one of those breaks. But the next section just picks right up where the conversation left off in the previous subsection. And there are other times where you'll be in the middle of like a really long section, but there's clearly like just stops talking about one thing, switches to another topic in the very next line. It's like, but are, are we done talking about yeah, that club? Okay, I guess we're moving on to something else now. It's like, why wasn't there one of those little breaks right there? I think the chapters could have been divided up a little more evenly at times. There's more natural breaks along the way that should have had a break, but it's not a huge problem. It just does stand out, especially when you're going through really long chapters with a ton of text. You're looking for those break points. Like, okay, I need to put this down for a while and tend to something else. Oh God, there's four more pages. That's like another half hour of reading to get to the next break point. Some more subdivisions could have helped out. But yeah, it's been an incredibly interesting read. It's exactly the kind of thing I enjoy reading about these scenes that I, wasn't part of course. I don't know much about. It's really interesting to get to understand more about the scene. And Deathrock's one of those things that has always kind of interested me. I've known about the scene for decades, but yeah, I've never heard a whole lot about it either. And anytime the name pops up, it's usually just like, oh yeah, that was Christian Death and some of the, it's a California thing in the early 80s, and it was called Deathrock, not death metal, and it has something to do with goth. It's usually about the extent of it. It's like, well, what does it have to do with goth and punk and all that? And I was like, okay, you get a better understanding of how this kind of became a branch out of that LA punk scene. So again, there's that kind of connection to, the scene that was covered in the other book. Punk scene, you get to a certain point here, Darby Crash dies, and after that, bands are doing different things. Some bands are going in one direction, some bands are going in another direction. Punk in California became more and more hardcore. Not everybody was cool with that. Not everybody wanted to go slam dance and beat the crap out of each other at those hardcore shows. Some bands went for, this kind of darker, but also in a way campier type vibe, a little more escapist. And they talk in here a lot about how just being in Hollywood was a big part of it because you had all this older, movie prop stuff and thrift stores full of, all these old costumes and things that really played into here's a bunch of, poor broke kids looking for an identity, And yeah, you can buy all this stuff dirt cheap in thrift stores and, have this kind of, old grand looking elegance that's tied to the whole Hollywood thing anyway, because you can buy these, insanely fancy dresses from the 1930s for next to nothing in the thrift store all over the place. So it's interesting how all that kind of, fed into the development of this particular, offshoot from the LA punk scene. And yeah, it's well, for all the different bands and creativity, it's interesting how a lot of it just didn't ever, become a bigger thing. And a big theme for that throughout the books is definitely drug use. That there's a lot of hard drugs on the scene, and that, of course, caused a lot of problems for people trying to ever move forward for bands to gain any momentum and make it to, a larger tier of visibility. It's not necessarily something all the bands were trying to do, and that's okay too. But yeah, I think it definitely helps explain why this scene remained relatively small, why the recording output was not as prolific as other scenes, and as such, why it was, sort of relegated to being a niche scene that you just never hear a whole lot about. And as a result, Mikey got to write this incredibly extensive book about it to help fill in those gaps and make sure that the information on all of those smaller projects wasn't lost because a lot of it is interesting. Have I checked out every band in the book? Oh, Lord, no. Have I liked everyone that I have checked out? Not really. Have I liked some of them a lot? Yeah, some of them are pretty cool and interesting sounding. And as such, I'll probably add some things here and there to my shopping list. But I've only been able to check out a handful of them here and there. I've got tons of metal listening to do, of course. Not easy to go down a brand new rabbit hole and check everything out. But it has been a really interesting read. And if you're up for a long-term commitment of a book, that's going to be some slow going, but really informative, and you like this style of music, I'd highly recommend tracking it down. If I didn't mention it at the start, the book it's copyrighted 2018. I believe it was actually first available for purchase in 2019. So it's been out around 5 years or so. A lot of folks may already have heard of it, and if so, that's great. I know when I mentioned it briefly on a live stream a couple of weeks ago, there were several people who were immediately like, "Whoa, what's that? Can you show that again? What was the title of that?" So I'm not the only person that had not seen it before. And hey, if this video helps a few more people find out about it and get some enjoyment from reading and learning about the scene, that's awesome. All right, that's going to do it for this video. So let's talk Deathrock in the comments down below. Is it a scene that you're into, interested in, but not familiar with? Are there particular bands or albums that you would highly recommend to people who are first checking it out? Yeah, let's assume maybe 45 Grave and Christian Death again. Those are the two that are pretty highly visible and readily available. What are the next steps that you'd recommend for someone else to check out if they've enjoyed some stuff by those bands and now want to go, a little bit deeper into checking out the scene? Leave comments down below. Help folks explore the scene a bit more. That would be awesome. All right, let's wrap this one up. So, until next time, everyone take care. And as always, keep breaking through the door looking for tasty brains to eat.